I heard this crash in the ensuite at about 2 in the morning and raced in. He was unconscious on the floor, his head split open, called the ambulance, took him into the hospital, and they said yes, had a heart attack. Next morning, Sunday morning, our daughter and I were sitting with him and realised his mouth was drooping and his speech was getting slurred, so we mentioned it to the sister. They did a CAT scan, and it was a registrar who was on because it was Sunday, and he read the CAT scan and looked at the top of Lloyd's brain and said, no, he hasn't had a stroke. So they put him in the cardiac unit, and 3 days later he was very, very ill and called in the neurologist, read the scan again and said, look, you've had a brain stem stroke. And so a lot of damage was done in that time because he wasn't given correct treatment.
I guess I'd have to say that at that stage I wasn't in a position to really think through as to how I felt, except, and I've mentioned this to a number of people, I felt terribly guilty.
Because we were very active, travelled around Australia with our caravan. He felt that I was going to be tied up caring for him for the rest of my life. And I think the guilt was the fact he felt. He did say to me, I've ruined your life.
I guess it was a bit of a shock when I had a second stroke.
Lloyd was vomiting very severely and terrible headache, and so we called the ambulance. He was just put on a trolley and basically not very much done, just checked every now and then. And so I went to the doctor and said, you have to make a decision. You have to either admit him or send him home. So he said, well, if he can get up and walk, he can go home. So he got him up and he staggered down the corridor with his walking stick and he said, oh, he can go home. The next day he had another major stroke and he was having a hemorrhage the second time. Our own doctor said, when I spoke to him, he was very angry. He could not understand why a man who had had a major stroke 12 months ago and was exhibiting further signs of stroke would have been sent 40 kilometres out to Sunbury at midnight. So again, it was another, this time 2.5 months in rehab, learning to walk again, getting out of the wheelchair a second time.
I was, well, I used the term pig-headed, and when they said you're going to stay in the wheelchair, get used to it, I just said, well, no, I'm not.
Lloyd went through tremendous pain to get himself out of that wheelchair with all the physio, and I used to remember they'd bring him back to his bed and they'd have to give him painkillers after his physio sessions, and it was really difficult to sit and watch him suffering so much because you don't realise how much stroke victims suffer afterwards.
The therapists were marvellous. Their patience, it was boundless. I was amazed.
He would never have got out of that wheelchair if it hadn't been for that young physio. He said to Lloyd, I'm going to get you out of this wheelchair, and he did.
I'm now relatively independent, not totally, but not too bad. I even got my driver's licence back.